The emergency broadcast had been looping for 3 days straight, but Marcus Reynolds barely heard it anymore as he pressed his back against the cold brick wall of the abandoned grocery store. His breath came in short, controlled bursts while his fingers tightened around the aluminum baseball bat he had grabbed from the sporting goods section. Through the shattered glass window, he could see them shuffling through the parking lot, at least 24 of the infected, their vacant eyes scanning for any sign of movement, any hint of life to consume. Marcus had been a high school history teacher just 72 hours ago, spending his evenings grading papers and coaching Little League on weekends. Now he was trapped, alone, and running out of options as the morning sun cast long shadows across a world that had collapsed faster than anyone could have imagined. The outbreak had started in the downtown district, or at least that was what the news reported before the stations went dark. Marcus remembered watching the footage on his phone while stuck in traffic, thinking it had to be some kind of elaborate hoax or publicity stunt. The images of people attacking each other in broad daylight, the chaos spreading through the streets like wildfire, it all seemed too impossible to be real. But reality had a cruel way of making itself known. By the time he reached his apartment building, the screaming had already started on the lower floors. He had grabbed whatever supplies he could carry and ran, leaving behind everything he had built in his 34 years of life. His books, his photographs, his carefully organized collection of vintage records, all of it abandoned in the desperate scramble for survival. Now, as he crouched behind an overturned shopping cart, Marcus noticed movement from the storage room at the back of the store. His heart hammered against his ribs as he slowly turned, bat raised, ready to defend himself against whatever emerged from the darkness. But instead of the grotesque, contorted face of the infected, he saw a young woman, probably in her mid-20s, with dirt-streaked blonde hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. She held a crowbar in one hand and pressed a finger to her lips with the other, signaling for silence. Her green eyes were sharp and alert, scanning him quickly, assessing whether he was a threat or an ally. Behind her, 2 more figures emerged from the shadows. The first was an older man, perhaps in his 60s, with silver hair and the weathered hands of someone who had spent a lifetime working outdoors. He carried a hunting rifle with the comfortable familiarity of an experienced shooter. The second was a teenage boy, maybe 17, clutching a backpack to his chest like it contained the most precious cargo in the world. The blonde woman moved forward with careful, deliberate steps, avoiding the broken glass and scattered cans that littered the floor. When she reached Marcus, she leaned close enough for him to hear her whisper. Her voice was steady despite the circumstances, carrying the kind of confidence that came from someone who had already survived the impossible. She introduced herself as Jennifer Hayes, a former paramedic who had been on duty when the first infected patients started flooding the emergency room. The older man was Robert Mitchell, a retired Marine who had been visiting his daughter in the city when everything fell apart. The teenager was Tyler Brooks, who had been separated from his family during the initial panic and had been surviving on his own until Jennifer and Robert found him hiding in a pharmacy 2 days ago. They had been moving from building to building, searching for supplies and other survivors, trying to make their way toward the river where rumors suggested a safe zone had been established. Marcus felt a surge of hope for the first time since the outbreak began, but it was immediately tempered by the sound of shattering glass from the front of the store. The infected had detected something and they were coming inside. Jennifer's eyes met his, and in that moment, an unspoken agreement passed between them. They were strangers bound together by catastrophe, but they would face whatever came next as a group. Robert chambered a round in his rifle while Tyler pulled out a flashlight from his backpack. Marcus adjusted his grip on the bat and positioned himself between the infected and his new companions. The battle for survival was about to begin, and none of them knew if they would see another sunrise. The infected burst through the front entrance like a wave of decay and hunger, their twisted bodies moving with an unnatural jerky motion that made Marcus's stomach turn. Robert didn't hesitate, raising his rifle and firing 3 precise shots that dropped the first infected in their tracks. But the sound echoed through the empty store like a dinner bell, and Marcus knew it would draw every creature within a half-mile radius straight to their location. Jennifer grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the storage room, shouting for Tyler to follow as more of the infected poured through the broken windows and shattered doorway. The teenage boy stumbled over a display of canned goods, his backpack spilling open and scattering protein bars and water bottles across the floor. Marcus didn't think, he simply reacted, rushing back to haul Tyler to his feet while swinging his bat one-handed at an infected woman in a tattered business suit who had gotten too close. The impact sent the creature sprawling backward into two others, buying them precious seconds. They crashed into the storage room and Jennifer immediately began pushing a heavy metal shelving unit toward the door while Robert fired another controlled burst to keep the infected at bay. Marcus threw his shoulder against the shelving unit alongside Jennifer, feeling the muscles in his legs burning as they forced it into place as a barricade. Tyler was shaking, his face pale and his eyes wide with terror, but he managed to grab boxes of supplies and stack them against the door to reinforce their makeshift barrier. The infected slammed against the other side with relentless force, their inhuman moans and the scraping of their fingernails against metal creating a symphony of nightmares. Robert backed into the storage room and helped them wedge another shelf against the first one, then turned to survey their surroundings with the practiced eye of someone trained to assess tactical situations. The storage room was larger than Marcus had expected, with rows of industrial shelving holding bulk supplies, cleaning products and boxes of non-perishable goods. More importantly, Robert pointed out a loading dock door at the far end, currently sealed shut with a rolling metal gate. Jennifer was already moving toward it, checking for any sign that the infected had found their way to the back of the building. She pressed her ear against the cold metal, listening intently for several heartbeats before nodding to the group. The alley behind the store seemed clear at least for now. Tyler had recovered enough to start repacking his backpack, this time adding more supplies from the storage room shelves. Marcus noticed the kid's hands were still trembling, but there was a determination in his eyes that hadn't been there before, a hardening that came from facing death and surviving. Robert explained in a low, authoritative voice that they needed to move fast and smart. The gunshots would draw infected from all directions, and they had maybe 10 minutes before this location became completely overrun. Jennifer outlined their options with the clinical precision of someone used to making life-or-death decisions under pressure. They could try to reach the hospital 6 blocks east, which might have medical supplies and possibly other survivors, or they could continue toward the river where the rumored safe zone supposedly waited. Marcus shared what he knew about the area, his knowledge as a longtime resident suddenly becoming valuable currency in this new world. He remembered an office building 2 streets over with a parking garage that connected to an underground maintenance tunnel system, something he had learned about during a city planning presentation at the school board meeting months ago. The banging on the storage room door was getting louder, more insistent, and they could hear the shelving unit beginning to shift under the constant assault. Tyler asked the question they were all thinking. What happened if there was no safe zone at the river? What if they were running toward nothing but another dead end? Jennifer put a hand on the boy's shoulder and told him that standing still meant certain death, but moving forward meant hope, even if it was just a sliver. Robert began checking his ammunition, counting rounds with the efficiency of long practice, and announced he had maybe 20 shots left before the rifle became nothing more than an expensive club. Marcus felt the weight of their situation settling over him like a heavy blanket, but he also felt something else, a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced since before the outbreak. Jennifer worked the manual crank on the loading dock door while Robert kept his rifle trained on the barricaded entrance, where the infected continued their relentless assault against the weakening shelves. Marcus helped Tyler gather supplies into whatever bags they could find, stuffing backpacks with water bottles, energy bars, canned food, and anything else that might keep them alive another day. The metal gate rose with agonizing slowness, each rotation of the crank producing a grinding squeal that seemed impossibly loud in the confined space. When the gate had lifted 3 feet off the ground, Jennifer dropped to her stomach and peered underneath into the alley beyond. She held her breath, watching for any movement, any sign of the infected lurking in the shadows between the dumpsters and abandoned delivery trucks. After what felt like an eternity, she gave the all-clear signal and motioned for Tyler to slide through first. The teenager didn't argue, dropping onto his belly and army crawling under the gate with his overstuffed backpack scraping against the concrete. Marcus went next, his larger frame barely fitting through the gap as he squeezed into the alley and immediately pressed himself against the wall, scanning for threats. Jennifer followed with practiced ease, moving like someone who had done this before, and finally Robert backed toward the opening while keeping his weapon aimed at the storage room door. The shelving unit gave a metallic shriek and shifted several inches inward just as the retired Marine dropped and rolled under the gate. Marcus grabbed the chain on the other side and released the brake, letting the gate slam down with a thunderous crash that echoed off the brick walls surrounding them. The alley was a narrow corridor of urban decay, filled with overflowing dumpsters, scattered trash, and the lingering smell of rot that Marcus couldn't tell was from ordinary garbage or something far worse. Robert took point, moving with the silent efficiency of his military training, his rifle sweeping the shadows as they advanced toward the street. Jennifer stayed close to Tyler, her crowbar ready, while Marcus brought up the rear with his baseball bat, constantly checking behind them for any pursuing infected. They could hear the creatures on the other side of the building, their frustrated moans growing louder as more joined the swarm around the grocery store. The sound was like nothing Marcus had ever experienced, a collective hunger that seemed to vibrate through the very air itself. They emerged from the alley onto a street that looked like a photograph of the apocalypse. Abandoned cars sat at odd angles, their doors hanging open, windows smashed and dark stains painting the pavement around them. Bodies lay where they had fallen, some showing obvious signs of infection, others apparently trampled or torn apart in the chaos of those first terrible hours. Tyler made a choking sound and turned away, his face green, and Jennifer quietly reminded him to keep moving, to not look too closely, to focus on surviving the next minute and then the minute after that. Marcus felt his own gorge rising but swallowed it down, forcing himself to become numb to the horror because the alternative was paralysis and paralysis meant death. Robert led them in a crouching run across the street, using the abandoned vehicles as cover while they made their way toward the office building Marcus had mentioned. They were halfway across when an infected man in a postal uniform lurched out from behind an overturned bus, his carrier bag still strapped across his torn chest. The creature's clouded eyes locked onto them and it released a bone-chilling shriek that Marcus recognized as a hunting call. Jennifer moved first, stepping forward and swinging her crowbar in a vicious arc that connected with the infected postal worker's skull with a sickening crunch. The creature dropped, but its shriek had done the damage. From side streets and buildings, answering calls echoed back, and suddenly the seemingly empty urban landscape came alive with shambling figures. Robert barked orders like they were his unit, pointing Tyler toward a gap between two cars while Jennifer helped clear a path through grasping hands and snapping teeth. Marcus found himself fighting on pure instinct, his bat rising and falling in a rhythm he didn't know he possessed, each impact jarring his shoulders but driving back the infected that pressed in from all sides. They fought their way forward meter by meter, a tiny island of desperate humanity in an ocean of the undead, each of them knowing that one mistake, one slip, one moment of hesitation could mean joining the ranks of the monsters. The office building's glass entrance was completely shattered, offering both easy access and a terrifying reminder that nothing was secure anymore. Marcus was breathing hard, his arms aching from the constant swinging of the bat, his shirt soaked with sweat despite the cool morning air. Tyler had taken a fall during their desperate sprint, scraping his hands bloody on the asphalt, but Jennifer had hauled him up without breaking stride, practically dragging the teenager the last 20 yards to relative safety. Robert fired his last few rounds to scatter the closest infected, then slammed the butt of his rifle into the face of a creature that got too close before diving through the broken entrance behind the others. They found themselves in a marble-floored lobby that had once been the picture of corporate elegance but now looked like a war zone, with overturned furniture, scattered papers and ominous dark stains painting abstract patterns across the expensive stone. Marcus didn't waste time catching his breath, immediately searching for the elevator banks that would lead them to the parking garage levels below ground. Jennifer was doing rapid triage on Tyler, checking the scrapes on his hands and knees to make sure none of the infected had broken his skin, because they all understood that even the smallest bite or scratch meant a death sentence. The teenager assured her he was fine, that he had just tripped over his own feet, but his voice cracked with barely suppressed panic. Robert was already pushing a heavy reception desk toward the entrance, barricading it as best he could while keeping watch on the street outside where dozens of infected were converging on their location. Marcus found the emergency exit stairwell and tested the door, relieved when it opened smoothly on well-oiled hinges, revealing a concrete shaft leading both up and down into darkness. They gathered at the stairwell entrance and Robert pulled out a small flashlight from his jacket pocket, the beam cutting through the shadows below them. Marcus explained that the parking garage had 3 subterranean levels, and if his memory was correct, the maintenance tunnel access was on the lowest level near the building's mechanical systems. Jennifer asked the critical question. What if the tunnels were flooded with infected, trapped underground with nowhere to run? Marcus admitted he didn't know, that he was working with information from a boring presentation he had barely paid attention to, but it was the best option they had. The alternative was staying in the building and hoping they could outlast a siege by creatures that never got tired, never got hungry for anything except human flesh, and never stopped hunting. Tyler volunteered to go first, perhaps trying to prove himself after his stumble outside, but Robert firmly declined and took point with his rifle, though they all knew ammunition was critically low. They descended into the darkness with only the single flashlight to guide them, their footsteps echoing off concrete walls in a rhythm that seemed impossibly loud. The stairwell smelled of oil and stale air, and Marcus noticed with growing unease that there were no bodies, no signs of struggle, nothing to indicate that anyone had fled down here during the initial outbreak. That could mean it was safe, or it could mean something far worse was waiting for them in the depths. The first parking level was a cavern of shadows and silent vehicles, the flashlight beam revealing row after row of abandoned cars covered in a thin layer of dust. They moved through quickly, checking between vehicles, nerves stretched tight as piano wire. The second level was much the same, though here they found evidence of occupation: makeshift bedding in one corner, empty food containers, and a child's stuffed animal sitting propped against a concrete pillar. Jennifer picked up the toy, a worn teddy bear with one eye missing, and Tyler asked quietly what happened to whoever had been hiding here. Nobody answered because they all knew the possibilities and none of them were good. The third and lowest level was where everything changed. As they descended the final flight of stairs, Robert's flashlight caught movement in the darkness ahead, but not the jerking, uncoordinated shambling of the infected. These movements were deliberate, controlled, human. The flashlight beam suddenly multiplied as several other lights clicked on, momentarily blinding them, and a woman's voice called out with military authority, demanding they identify themselves immediately. Marcus raised his hands slowly, squinting against the harsh glare of multiple flashlights trained on their group, his heart pounding as he tried to determine if they had just stumbled into salvation or a different kind of danger. Robert kept his rifle lowered but ready, his military instincts clearly warring between cooperation and caution, while Jennifer stepped protectively in front of Tyler, her crowbar still gripped tightly in one hand. The voice came again, sharper this time, and Marcus called out that they were survivors, uninfected, just looking for a way out of the city. The lights lowered slightly, revealing a group of 8 people arranged in a defensive semicircle around what appeared to be a fortified position near the maintenance entrance. The woman who had spoken stepped forward, and Marcus could now see she was in her early 40s, wearing tactical gear that suggested either military or law enforcement background, with sharp features and calculating eyes that assessed them with professional scrutiny. She introduced herself as Captain Diana Foster, formerly of the National Guard unit that had been deployed to contain the outbreak before everything fell apart. Behind her stood a mixed group that looked like they had been through their own private hell. A man in mechanic's coveralls with grease-stained hands and a tire iron resting on his shoulder, a young Asian woman in nursing scrubs who clutched a medical bag, twin brothers who couldn't have been older than 25 wearing college athletics gear, an elderly African-American woman with kind eyes and a pistol tucked into her belt, and 2 others who hung back in the shadows. Diana explained that they had been holding this position for 4 days, using the parking garage as a staging area while they planned their next move. The maintenance tunnels did exist, but they were partially flooded and filled with dangers that made the streets above look almost welcoming by comparison. Jennifer immediately identified herself as a paramedic and offered to help with any medical needs, establishing common ground, while Robert shared his Marine background, which seemed to ease some of Diana's suspicion. The woman in nursing scrubs, who introduced herself as Amanda Liu, practically rushed forward asking if Jennifer had any experience with infection treatment or field medicine. The desperation in her voice made Marcus's stomach tighten, and he noticed for the first time that one of the twin brothers was sitting down, his leg wrapped in makeshift bandages that were soaked through with blood. Amanda explained in a rushed whisper that his name was Kevin Patterson, and he had been injured 3 hours ago when part of their group had attempted a supply run to a pharmacy 2 blocks away. His brother Derek hovered nearby, his face a mask of barely controlled fear. Tyler asked the question that Marcus was afraid to voice: had Kevin been bitten? Amanda shook her head quickly, explaining it was a clean wound from broken glass, no infection, but he was losing blood and they didn't have the supplies to properly treat him. Jennifer immediately went into professional mode, kneeling beside Kevin and carefully unwrapping the bandages to assess the damage. Marcus watched as the 2 medical professionals worked together, their trained hands moving with confidence even in the dim light, and he felt a small measure of hope that maybe, just maybe, they had found people who could actually organize a real chance at survival. Diana gathered Robert and Marcus aside, along with the mechanic who introduced himself as Leonard Price, and spread out a hand-drawn map on the hood of a nearby car. She had been marking routes, safe zones, infected concentrations, and potential resources with the systematic approach of someone trained in tactical planning. The map painted a grim picture. The infection had spread throughout the entire downtown area and was pushing outward in all directions like a malignant growth. The rumored safe zone at the river had existed briefly, but Diana had radio confirmation that it had been overrun 2 days ago when infected overwhelmed the hastily constructed barriers. The military had pulled back to establish a new perimeter 15 miles outside the city, but reaching it meant crossing through the densest infected zones with no guarantee the military would let them through even if they survived the journey. Leonard spoke up for the first time, his voice carrying the rough accent of someone who had worked with his hands all his life, suggesting an alternative that Diana had been reluctant to consider. Before the outbreak, he had worked on the city's subway system, and he knew about old service tunnels that connected to a maintenance depot on the city's northern edge, well away from the downtown infection epicenter. The subway tunnel entrance was a gaping maw of darkness that seemed to swallow Leonard's flashlight beam, and Marcus felt every instinct screaming at him not to descend into that black throat of concrete and steel. But the decision had been made after 2 hours of debate, with Diana finally agreeing that Leonard's route offered better odds than trying to fight through miles of infested streets. Jennifer had managed to stabilize Kevin's leg wound with supplies from Amanda's medical bag, stitching the gash closed with steady hands while Derek held his brother's hand, and the elderly woman, who had introduced herself as Mrs. Eleanor Washington, whispered prayers that Marcus found oddly comforting despite his own lapsed faith. They had divided into 2 groups for the journey. Diana, Robert, Leonard, and one of the shadowy figures named Craig Sanderson would lead the way, while Marcus, Jennifer, Tyler, Amanda, and Mrs. Washington would help Kevin move while Derek stayed protectively close to his injured twin. They descended through a maintenance access shaft that Leonard had to pry open with a crowbar, the metal protesting with shrieks that echoed through the parking garage and made everyone wince. The ladder down was slick with moisture and decades of grime, and getting Kevin down with his injured leg became an agonizing process that consumed precious minutes they didn't have. Marcus could hear the infected upstairs, their numbers growing as the scent or sound of living humans drew them like moths to flame. Tyler showed unexpected strength, helping support Kevin's weight while Derek climbed below to guide his brother's feet to each rung. By the time they all reached the bottom, Marcus's shoulders were burning and his hands were scraped raw, but they were in the tunnel system with the access shaft sealed above them. Leonard led them through passages that seemed to exist in layers, the modern subway tunnels giving way to older infrastructure, then even older brick-lined passages that the mechanic explained dated back over 100 years. The air was thick and damp, carrying smells of mold, rust, and standing water that made breathing feel like swallowing soup. Their flashlights created dancing shadows that played tricks on Marcus's exhausted mind, making him see movement where there was none, or worse, making him second-guess whether that shape ahead was just debris or something waiting in the darkness. Diana maintained strict light discipline, allowing only 2 flashlights on at a time to conserve batteries, which meant half the group stumbled through near total darkness. They had been underground for nearly an hour when they encountered the first real obstacle, a section of tunnel that had partially collapsed, leaving only a narrow gap between fallen concrete and the ceiling that would require crawling through on their bellies. Robert went first to scout, his lean frame disappearing into the gap while the rest waited in tense silence. His muffled voice came back reporting that the passage was stable and opened up after about 20 feet, but it would be tight and Kevin would have serious difficulty. Jennifer made the call that they would slide Kevin through on a makeshift stretcher made from someone's jacket, with people on both sides pulling and pushing. It was during this delicate operation, with half the group on one side of the collapse and half on the other, that they heard the sound that made Marcus's blood turn to ice. Splashing footsteps echoing from somewhere deeper in the tunnel system, and they weren't alone down here. Diana immediately ordered lights out except for one, her hand moving to the pistol at her hip while Robert aimed his nearly empty rifle into the darkness. The splashing grew louder, accompanied by a dragging sound and labored breathing that was definitely human or had been human recently. Craig, who had been silent for most of the journey, suddenly whispered a horrified curse and pointed his flashlight against Diana's orders, the beam illuminating a nightmare stumbling toward them through ankle-deep water. It was an infected, but unlike any they had seen before, This one was covered in some kind of fungal growth that seemed to pulse with bioluminescence, creating an eerie green glow. The glowing infected lurched toward them with unsettling speed, and Marcus realized with horror that the fungal growth wasn't just on the surface but seemed to have twisted the creature's body into something even more monstrous than the typical infected. Robert didn't waste his limited ammunition, instead rushing forward with his rifle held like a club and delivering a devastating blow that sent the creature sprawling into the water. Diana was right behind him, her pistol barking twice in the confined space, the muzzle flashes temporarily blinding everyone as the infected finally stopped moving. Leonard urged them forward with desperate intensity, explaining that where there was one of those things, there would be more, that the fungal growth thrived in the damp darkness and seemed to enhance the infected somehow. They abandoned caution for speed, pulling Kevin through the collapsed section with less care than Jennifer would have liked, everyone driven by primal terror of what might be breeding in these forgotten tunnels. The passage opened into a larger chamber that Leonard identified as an old pump station, and here they found evidence that they weren't the first survivors to attempt this route. Bodies lay scattered across the floor, some clearly infected, others appearing to be survivors who hadn't made it, their supplies spilled around them like offerings to the darkness. Mrs. Washington said another prayer while Tyler helped gather what usable items remained, his hands shaking as he avoided looking too closely at the faces of the dead. Amanda discovered a working radio among the supplies, its battery indicator showing just enough charge for maybe one transmission. Diana grabbed it immediately and began cycling through frequencies, searching for any sign of the military perimeter or other survivor groups. What came through the static made Marcus's heart leap. A clear, strong signal broadcasting on a loop, identifying itself as Forward Operating Base Nightingale and providing coordinates for the northern evacuation point. The message specified that survivors should approach during daylight hours with hands visible and be prepared for decontamination screening. Diana checked her watch and calculated quickly, explaining that if they maintained their current pace, they could reach the maintenance depot within 2 hours and the evacuation point by mid-afternoon. The news energized the entire group, even Kevin managing a weak smile as Derek squeezed his shoulder with renewed hope. They pressed onward through tunnels that gradually sloped upward, leaving the water and the horror of the fungal infected behind them. Marcus found himself walking beside Jennifer, and they talked quietly about what came next, about whether the world could ever truly recover from something like this. She admitted she didn't know that her medical training had taught her about diseases and treatments, but nothing had prepared her for the complete collapse of civilization. Tyler overheard and added his own thoughts, speaking with the resilience of youth about rebuilding, about learning from the mistakes that had allowed the outbreak to spread so quickly. Marcus felt something shift inside him, a transformation from the terrified teacher who had cowered in a grocery store to someone who had found purpose in protecting others. Leonard's triumphant shout echoed through the tunnel as his flashlight found the maintenance depot entrance, a heavy metal door with a manual release that opened onto a concrete platform. They emerged into pale daylight filtered through grimy windows set high in the walls, and the simple sight of natural light brought tears to Mrs. Washington's eyes. The depot was clear of infected, filled instead with old subway cars and equipment that offered multiple defensive positions. Diana immediately began organizing a security perimeter while Robert climbed to the windows to scout their route to the evacuation point. What he saw made him call everyone over with barely contained excitement. In the distance, maybe 3 miles away, they could see helicopters circling and the unmistakable signs of a fortified military position. They rested for 30 minutes, sharing the last of their supplies and checking weapons, preparing for one final push through whatever infected stood between them and salvation. Marcus looked at the faces around him, these strangers who had become something more through shared trauma and desperate survival. Diana stood and announced it was time to move, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had led troops through impossible situations. They filed out of the depot into the afternoon sun, a small band of survivors who had descended into darkness and emerged defiant, ready to face whatever came next because they had learned the most important lesson of the apocalypse. Alone they were vulnerable, but together they were unbreakable, and as long as they stood united, there was hope for a future beyond the infection.